Hey guys, my name is Eric Pang and I'm the founder of Daily Fantasy Nerd. In this video I'm going to go over a new feature that I'm really excited about. It's projected usage rates by team. And we've started showing our projected opportunity stats for the upcoming week. So that's pass attempts, rush attempts, and targets, which are great stats to look at because you get a better idea of how many opportunities is your guy going to have to try to score fantasy points. And the more opportunities you have, the higher of a floor and ceiling that you have. Whereas the fewer opportunity stats that you have, the more volatile your results are going to be. So let's go ahead and start taking a look. So you can find the new feature right here at the projected usage rate link. And if you click on that, it'll bring up a pop-up with a table of usage rates. And before I dive into the table here, I'm going to first define how I came up with our usage rate definition here. And so what we're doing is taking the projected player opportunities, so pass attempts plus rush attempts and targets. So for QBs, you'll have like Russell Wilson will have both pass attempts and rush attempts. For pass catching running backs, you're going to have both rush attempts and targets. Generally, receivers mostly have targets, but sometimes they get a few rush attempts. So this way it kind of combines all of them. And we'll divide that player's opportunities divided by the total team projected opportunities, so pass attempts plus rush attempts here. And so this is a good way of getting a general idea of how much in a team's offense is a certain player used. And so you generally want to, in cash games, try to target high usage players in a high scoring game. And you generally want to avoid lower usage players across the board. So let me walk you through what we have in this table here. So we have the team and your opponent. We have Vegas odds, both the expected points and the spread, and then a breakdown of each position and the usage rates attached to them. We went over the Vegas odds in the NFL DFS stats and strategies you need to know video, but I'll do a brief overview here for those of you who haven't taken a look at that video. So the high scoring games are generally the games that you want to target. The spread is where it gets a little bit more interesting because the game flow kind of shifts depending on who's up and who's down. So for example, Miami here is favored by 10 this week. And let's say they're up by 10 or let's say even 2 touchdowns or more at the end of the third, start of the fourth quarter. What that means is that for the most part, the offense is going to shift heavily to the running game because they want to start running out the clock. And so your QB and your wide receivers may not get as many opportunities to score if the team is up by a lot. And so it can make sense to target running backs in games where they're really favored because they're going to get a lot more opportunities, and trying to target passing games, so QBs and wide receivers in games where the game's going to be close, or even let's say Atlanta here where they have a pretty high scoring total but they're actually not favored, and so they're probably going to need to skew more towards passing later in the game, and so they have a lot of upside. Now Vegas isn't always correct, so let's say in this Miami-Cleveland game the Miami defense gives up a lot of points to Cleveland. Well, in that situation, knowing who to target at high usage on the wide receivers could make sense because then it becomes a shootout. And that's really what you're trying to shoot for in GPPs. And so in cash games, you want to try to focus on the safe plays. In GPPs, you want to potentially get a little bit more aggressive. And targeting those wide receivers in a high spread game could be a way of finding low ownership options available. Next, we have the QB ownership or the QB usage. And so you can see here that Andrew Luck has about 64% usage, whereas Dak Prescott only has 53%. Any QB that has a low usage rate implies that the running backs are going to have a much higher usage rate. And so we color code all of these stats where bright orange is a favorable stat and dark blue is an unfavorable stat. It's a little bit different for the spread because there's people that it benefit and people that it doesn't benefit on both sides. But generally, this is a very quick and easy way for you to quickly identify good plays. You can also sort by all of these columns, so you can sort by the usage rate. And so you can quickly find out which quarterbacks tend to have a higher percentage output of their offensive output. And so you can also find out which running backs fall in that category as well. And so, Gurley here might not be a great play, even though he has high usage. The fact that they're going to be behind implies that there might be a little bit more passing at the end. That's why you want to kind of focus on teams that are going to be ahead. So like David Johnson here could be a good play. The interesting thing for the RB2 position is you're starting to get a better idea of where there's running back by committee. So for example, Minnesota, we're projecting to have McKinnon and Asiata splitting the workload. And it's a pretty high running back usage because you can see Bradford's usage is pretty low. But because Adrian Peterson's out, they're kind of splitting the workload more. And in GPPs, these are potential opportunities to consider the second back. Whereas most of the time, DFS players will roster the first running back. And so for GPPs, it can potentially make sense to take a look at the RB2s. If they snipe 1 or 2 touchdowns, that could be a huge swing, especially because ownership for these guys are going to be a lot lower. Next, we have the wide receiver 1. So these are kind of your obvious top tier wide receivers on any given week. What's more interesting, again, is taking a look at the wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3s, because this can give you a better sense of which offenses are more kind of evenly balanced across your wide receivers. And if you sort it the other way, which offenses are more heavily skewed towards the first tier wide receiver, so that you can see that these offenses will tend to skew more towards the wide receiver 1. And so when you're thinking about GPP Stack Strategy, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, stacking makes a lot of sense because anytime your wide receiver gets a touchdown, both the quarterback and your wide receivers score points. And so you get a lot higher correlation that way. It's a lot more risky, so you kind of want to avoid it for cash games, but for GPPs, it's a very common strategy. So looking at these usage rates can help you figure out, okay, for offenses that have heavily skewed towards wide receiver 1, I'd lean more towards a single wide receiver stack, whereas guys that have high usage rates at the wide receiver 2 position, you could fade the wide receiver 1, or you could do a double 2 wide receiver stack. And likewise, if you sort by the wide receiver 3, you can even do a 3 wide receiver stack. These are your most evenly balanced offenses. Or you could fade the first one and go both the second and third. Generally, again, fading, you're kind of sacrificing some upside, but you're potentially gaining more because the ownership for some of these permutations will be a lot lower than their odds for hitting big. And then finally, you can take a look at which offenses skew towards the tight end position more. And so figuring out, for some of these, you could stack like Edelman and Gronk, could make sense. But generally looking at how do you find the highest usage rates to pair together with your quarterback in terms of figuring out, do you do more than just a wide receiver QB stack? Does it make sense to do a wide receiver, 2 wide receivers, 2 wide receivers and a tight end, a wide receiver and a tight end? It helps you narrow down a little more, because if you just blindly do 2 wide receivers or 3 wide receivers across the board, generally that's going to be a losing proposition. But if you kind of know where to pick how to approach those strategies, then it starts to make more sense. Also, a situation where it makes more sense to do 2 or 3 wide receivers and tight end stack is in games where there's high scoring offenses, and that's the case for both Green Bay and New Orleans this week. So I hope that this feature will be helpful for you. I hope this video was helpful. This is a feature that I've been really excited about putting together, that I'm going to be using a lot in my own GPP roster construction, as well as my cash roster construction. And you can lock in directly from here. So let's say I want to do a Green Bay stack. So I want to do, let's say, Rodgers. And let's say I want to just fade Jordy and go Cobb and Adams. I can lock in those players and then build optimal. And you'll see that we have all three players locked in here. And we still do have this stack QB and wide receiver option, so you can specify 1, 2 wide receivers. And so if you lock in one quarterback, it'll make sure to pair them up. But the benefit of this new usage rate feature is that you could do it all in one place in a much quicker manner. It allows you more fine granularity for you to figure out, like, okay, who do I specifically want to target? Who do I want to fade? But if you're, trying to be a little bit quicker on time, or you want the optimizer to do the heavy lifting for you, then you can specify which of these yourself. So let's do another example. Let's say I want to find high usage tight end. So let's say I want to stack, Carolina here with Cam Newton. Say I want to do Kelvin Benjamin and Greg Olsen. You can see here both Funchess and Ginn have a lot lower usage rates, so I'm kind of picking the higher usage rate guys across the board, and I'm hoping that this is already a high-scoring game. If Minnesota can keep the game close, then these guys have a lot of opportunity to potentially do a high-scoring game. So you'll see that we have all three of those players put in here. All right. Hopefully you'll be able to get value out of this new feature. And if you haven't had a chance to sign up for Daily Fantasy Nerd, you can do so by going to dailyfantasynerd.com and clicking Get Started Free. Thanks and good luck.